Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. On January 23rd, 2023, BC became the first province in Canada to receive a federal exemption to decriminalize some illicit drugs for personal use. Now, that doesn't mean that drugs are legal. It just means that drug users won't be arrested, charged, or have their drugs seized for personal possession of a small amount of cocaine, methamphetamine, MDMA, and opioids, including fentanyl. Last November, the BC NDP government passed Bill 34 that banned all drug use in most public spaces, including playgrounds. But 3 days before the law was set to come into force, a BC Supreme Court justice granted an injunction against Bill 34, ruling that irreparable harm will be caused if the act comes into force, a ruling that the BC NDP government will now appeal. So, does that mean that drug users can freely consume drugs in children's playgrounds? Here to explain is a freelance journalist based in the Vancouver area returning to the show. They are Dustin Godfrey, and this conversation is supported by Shelter Point Single Malt Whiskey, distinctly Vancouver Island, uniquely Shelter Point. So Dustin, with this Supreme Court ruling, does that effectively mean that people in BC can freely use drugs in children's playgrounds?
No.
Because that's what I've heard in the media.
Yeah. There's been a whole lot of misinformation and in a number of cases also disinformation kind of floating around about this court decision. And kind of one of the things that's particularly frustrating about it in this case is that it's kind of coming from all quarters, right? It's not just coming from the National Post, it's also coming from the Toronto Star. It's not just coming from the BC United, it's also coming from the BC NDP.
Right, because they wanted to pass this legislation to effectively bar drug users from using in playgrounds. So that's where I'm also confused.
Yeah, and so shortly before Bill 34 came in or was introduced by the BC NDP, they also asked Health Canada to amend the exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to exclude playgrounds from where people are allowed to possess drugs. Mm-hmm. And that particular rule is still in place. There was a sort of in Bill 34, it also had a provision that said that you're not allowed to consume drugs in playgrounds. The language between the two are pretty similar.
Okay, so the Health Canada exemption, so what does that mean? You can't do drugs or hold drugs in playgrounds?
So the Health Canada exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, that is what governs the sort of decriminalization pilot project in BC. And baked into it, there are some sort of areas where you're still not allowed to possess drugs. So initially it included daycares and schools, Coast Guard vessels and helicopters, army bases. Sure. And then in September, they amended it to include skate parks, playgrounds, and splash pads. Okay,
so Health Canada already said that you can't possess drugs, consume drugs in these places.
Yeah, exactly. And so the court ruling doesn't really challenge that at all.
Okay.
When that change came into effect, nobody really batted an eye. Nobody is challenging the playground ban there.
Right.
The issue with the sort of Bill 34 is sort of the breadth of the law and sort of the breadth of the police powers that are afforded by it. So
let's talk about Bill 34 then. Mm-hmm. If this law had become law and there was not a Supreme Court injunction, what would that have meant? Where would drug users not be able to do drugs when it comes to doing drugs in public?
This is basically 6 meters from a doorway or bus stop in parks, beaches, things like that. And then, all the other places that are already covered.
Okay.
And so when you kind of look at a map of the city, that's pretty much everywhere, especially in the downtown east side where there is a lot of people who are forced to use drugs outside.
It strikes me that this would disproportionately affect, one, unhoused people, but then two, people that may not have access to a safe consumption site.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the thing about it is that it's not people who are choosing to use outside. It's generally people who are kind of forced to use outside, in part because, they don't have their own housing, but also because they don't have a safe supply of drugs. And so, often they'll kind of want to use around other people so that they can be found in time for somebody to intervene in the event of an overdose. And so, yeah, like I say, in the case of this, the areas that are not covered by this, if you look at Google Street View or whatever and kind of map it out, there's like a few pockets of like sidewalk around the downtown east side that wouldn't be covered.
Right.
But then really it's kind of pushing people into the alleyways. And like the harm reduction movement has spent a lot of time, like pretty much the last couple of decades, trying to pull people out of the alleyways. Because again, like that's where people kind of wind up dying because they're not found in time.
Right. Wow. So I just want to be clear here. The Health Canada exemptions to decriminalization basically say that you can't use at several places, but including schools, daycares, playgrounds, splash pads. That's already entrenched in the law. The BC NDP basically wanted to expand that to cover more public spaces. And that's where the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, that's too wide of a breadth, basically.
Yeah. And like, I want to say that like part of the issue with the law that like a lot of people kind of ignore, like a lot of people talk about it as a public substance use issue. And like, yes, that's the name of the bill. And that is like a section of the bill, but there's a whole lot also dedicated towards like expanding police power to, basically continually displace unhoused people or unhoused drug users, I should say. And like, all they really need to tell somebody to move along is reasonable grounds to believe that a person has recently used drugs in this space. And like, there's like a legal test for reasonable grounds to believe. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what it is. I looked it up on Google. I found like a 24-page report explaining it.
Yeah.
So I don't think that that's really being tested on the ground. What's probably going to be happening on the ground is basically just police discretion. And what happens when you have police discretion is usually it disproportionately impacts certain people. And you kind of talked about this recently on your show with Harrison Mooney. It disproportionately impacts Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color.
This whole thing sounds like Bill 34 was effectively, in practice, killing decriminalization, like really taking a lot of the legs out of it in terms of what it was trying to accomplish. I guess one question I have is that there are going to be a lot of non-drug users who say, you know what? I just want to walk down the sidewalk, or I want to go to a park. Sure, it's not a playground, but I want to go to a park and I don't want to see people smoking meth or doing a rail of coke. What do you say to those folks? Because I can understand their concerns as well. And there is an idea of, social order, right? So what would the response be to them?
I do want to be like careful in not sort of like, there's sort of a ongoing campaign for like the last century, basically, of like demonizing unhoused people and drug users, right? And like, you're far more likely to be assaulted by somebody that you know than by like a stranger in general, right? And so I do want to be careful to like not validate sort of like the fear of the other in this case. What I think is kind of like a way that I would sort of talk about it is, why do people feel forced to use outside? And I think that's sort of like a myth that sort of gets like perpetuated about things like harm reduction, is that like people who are in favor of harm reduction just want people to be able to use drugs wherever, whenever, however, and that's it. That's all. But like the point is keeping people alive, and then also bringing in solutions like safe supply, giving them housing, having enough overdose prevention sites, things like that, right? Like giving them ways that they can not use.
So advocate for more services, if the visuals or that disorder troubles you. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, we spent a whole lot of resources basically just kind of like pushing people down when we could spend probably fewer resources just kind of like helping people up and like allowing them to sort of like live on their own, sort of like live with dignity and sort of be able to support themselves. Absolutely. Right? With housing, with income supports, with a safe supply of drugs. And, it's like really frustrating to kind of see this demonization expanding, not just like into sort of like all quarters of the sort of political spectrum. And it seems like there's like kind of fewer and fewer places where you're actually seeing people sort of actually like defend the need for giving people services.
Absolutely. Dustin, I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Folks, they are freelance journalist Dustin Godfrey, always producing great work. Find them on X and Substack. And thank you to Shelter Point Single Malt Whiskey for supporting local conversations, especially the uncomfortable ones that need unpacking. Now, after a little business, are you allowed to record people in public? Seems creepy, right? But is there a law against it? Kyla Lee will let us know up next.